The great warship Crown of Embers moved slowly through deep space like a sleeping giant. It was the largest ship in the Drakaveth Empire, longer than most human cities, covered in dark gold armor plates that caught the light of distant stars. Every hallway was carved with ancient dragon symbols. Every room smelled of burning wood and old stone. It was a ship built for power, built for royalty, built for pride. But tonight pride meant nothing. The sound came from the royal wing, a sharp, high, broken cry that cut through every wall, every door and every corridor of the ship. It was the sound of the royal hatchling, Prince Vorin, and he had been screaming for 3 days without stop. Not crying softly. Not whimpering. Screaming, the kind of sound that made even the biggest dragon guard step back without meaning to. The kind of sound that filled a room and stayed there long after it stopped. Except it never stopped. Emperor Soreth stood outside the royal chamber door with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He was tall even for a dragon, dark-scaled, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of cooling fire. Every soldier on this ship feared him. Every noble in the empire bowed when he entered a room. He had fought wars. He had signed treaties that changed the shape of worlds. He had never once shown weakness in public. But right now his son was screaming on the other side of that door and there was nothing he could do. Empress Vaila sat inside the chamber beside the hatchling's nest, her silver scales dull with exhaustion. She had not slept in 3 days. Her eyes were red at the edges. She kept one hand near Vorin at all times, not touching because touching made it worse, just near him. Close enough to feel like she was doing something. Close enough so that if he looked up he would see her there. Vorin was small. That was the thing about hatchlings, even royal ones, they were so much smaller than anyone expected. He was curled tight in the center of a nest built from the finest materials in the empire. Warm stone, heated silk lining, temperature controlled to exact perfection. The healers had checked the temperature 17 times. They had checked his blood, his scales, his tiny wings, his heartbeat. Everything came back the same answer every time. He was healthy. He had no injury. No illness. No fever. No poison. Nothing broken, nothing bleeding, nothing wrong that any scanner or healer could find. And yet he screamed like something was terribly, deeply wrong, and no one could figure out what it was. Head healer Dravon stood near the far wall of the chamber with his notes in hand, reading them for what felt like the 100th time. He was older than most dragons on the ship, gray around the edges of his dark scales, with sharp eyes that had seen 1,000 patients over a long career. He was the best healer in the empire. The emperor had personally requested him for this voyage. He had no answer. He had tried sound dampening. He had tried warm steam baths infused with calming herbs from the Drakaveth home forests. He had tried low light, complete darkness, bright light, silence, soft music played on ancient instruments. He had tried 4 different feeding formulas, 2 different nest materials, and 1 very old remedy passed down from a healer who had served 3 emperors before this one. Nothing worked. Not even for a few minutes. Not even for a moment. Outside in the corridor, the noble attendants whispered to each other in low voices. Everyone on the ship could hear Vorin screaming even through the thick walls. The crew members walked a little faster past the royal wing. The soldiers kept their eyes forward and said nothing. But everyone was thinking the same thing. A royal hatchling screaming without stop for 3 days was a very bad sign. In old Drakaveth tradition, it meant something dark was coming. It meant the stars were not favorable. It meant trouble ahead for the empire itself. Nobody said this out loud near the emperor. Nobody wanted to die that day. Lord Grieven, a senior noble with cold eyes and a careful tongue, stood near the emperor in the corridor and spoke in a low, measured voice. He suggested calling in a second team of healers from the nearest Drakaveth colony. He suggested trying a ritual that had not been used in 200 years. He suggested many things, all of them confident, all of them useless. The emperor listened and said nothing. On the other side of the ship, far from the royal wing in the smaller and much simpler section where the human diplomatic escort team was housed, a woman named Lena sat on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She had been listening to the screaming for 3 days too. Lena was not a soldier or a diplomat in the traditional sense. She was a cultural liaison. Her job was to understand other species, to bridge gaps, to help 2 very different kinds of people find common ground. Before this posting, she had spent 6 years working with young children in education programs back on Earth. She knew what distress sounded like. She knew what it sounded like when something small and helpless was trying very hard to tell the world something and the world was not listening. She had tried to ignore it. It was not her place. The royal family of the Drakaveth Empire did not need a human woman with a bag full of personal items walking into their most private chambers and offering opinions. She understood that. She respected that. She had told herself to stay in her section, do her assigned work, and leave the dragon royals to their own healers. But on the third night she sat up in the dark and listened to that sound again, that raw, exhausted, desperate little cry that never quite went quiet, and she made a decision. She got up. She picked up her small personal bag. She walked through the connecting corridor toward the royal wing, past two very large and very unimpressed dragon guards who looked at her the way large creatures usually looked at humans, with an expression somewhere between mild curiosity and complete dismissal. She asked politely if she could speak to someone about the hatchling. The guards told her politely that she should return to her section. She stood her ground, quietly without raising her voice, and said that she had experience with young children in distress and that she would very much like to help if that was possible. The guards were about to repeat themselves when Emperor Soreth stepped into the corridor from the chamber door. He had heard her voice. Or maybe he had just been standing there in the dark outside his son's room, and needed something, anything, to be different from the last 3 days of nothing working. He looked at her for a long moment. She was small by dragon standards. Most humans were. She had a plain bag over one shoulder and calm eyes, and she did not flinch when he looked at her, which he noted without meaning to. Behind him, through the thick door, Vorin screaming rose and fell and rose again. Lord Grievin appeared from down the corridor, his expression already forming an objection. Several noble attendants stopped walking and stared. Dravon stepped out from the chamber and looked at Lena with the flat, professional skepticism of a healer who had already tried everything and was not interested in suggestions from someone with no formal training. The Emperor looked at his head healer. He looked at his noble advisor. He looked back at the small human woman standing in his corridor at night with a bag on her shoulder, asking to help. He was tired. He was 3 days deep into a helplessness he had no name for. His wife had not slept. His son had not stopped screaming. His best healer had no answers. His oldest advisor had only theories. And this woman was standing here, calm, patient, not asking for anything except permission. The Emperor uncrossed his arms. He looked at Lena one more time. Then he spoke, quietly, without ceremony, without the weight of imperial language he usually carried in every word. Let the human try. The corridor went completely silent except for the sound of Prince Vorin screaming in the room behind him. Grievin opened his mouth. The Emperor did not look at him. Dravon pressed his lips together and said nothing. The guards stepped aside. The noble attendants looked at each other with wide eyes. Lena gave a small nod, adjusted the bag on her shoulder and walked through the door. Lena walked into the royal chamber and stopped just inside the doorway. She did not rush forward. She did not immediately go to the hatchling. She did not pull anything from her bag or start talking or ask anyone questions. She just stopped, stood still for a moment and looked at the room. The chamber was large, much larger than she expected. The ceiling was high and curved, like the inside of a shell. The walls were smooth and dark, made of the same cold metal as the rest of the warship, but polished until they reflected everything in a dull, gray shine. Long lights ran along the top edges of the walls, steady and bright, not warm, not soft, just bright. The kind of light that did not flicker, did not change, did not breathe. Just a flat, constant white glow that filled every corner of the room without shadow. The air was cold. Not uncomfortable for an adult, just cool, clean, and perfectly controlled. It smelled of nothing. That was the thing she noticed first, no smell at all. The air recyclers had filtered out everything. There was no wood smell, no earth smell, no warmth in the air. Just clean emptiness. In the center of the room sat the hatchling's nest. It was beautiful in the way that very expensive things are beautiful. Perfectly made, perfectly arranged, perfectly useless. The materials were fine and smooth and clearly chosen by someone who knew what luxury looked like but perhaps had forgotten what comfort felt like. Everything in the nest was the same temperature, the same texture, the same color. Soft, yes. Warm enough, technically. But all the same, all flat, all controlled. And in the middle of it, tiny and curled and absolutely furious, was Prince Vorin. He was smaller than Lena had imagined. His scales were pale gold at the edges with dark centers, still soft-looking the way newborn things always were. His small wings were pressed flat against his back. His eyes were squeezed shut. His tiny mouth was open and from it came that sound, that high, raw, endless cry that had filled the ship for 3 days. Lena looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to an open space on the floor about 2 meters from the nest, sat down cross-legged, placed her bag beside her, and did nothing. Empress Vaila watched her from her chair near the nest. Her expression was hard to read, somewhere between desperate hope and the kind of exhausted suspicion that comes from too many failed attempts. She said nothing. She had agreed to let the human try. She would watch. Drayvon stood near the wall with his arms crossed. He had his notes in one hand and his professional dignity in the other, and he was clearly not planning to put either of them down. He watched Lena sit on the floor, and his expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile and not quite a frown but carried the clear meaning of, "This is a waste of time." 2 attendants stood near the far door. They also watched. Everyone was watching. Lena did not watch them back. She watched Voren. She watched the way his body moved when he screamed, how his whole small frame tensed and released in a rhythm, how his claws scraped against the smooth base of the nest in a repeated motion, the same scratch again and again, like he was trying to grip something that kept slipping away. She watched the way his head turned slightly toward the wall lights and then away, then toward them again, like something about the light bothered him but he could not get away from it because it came from every direction equally. She watched his nostrils, tiny, still learning to work, flare and contract rapidly, pulling in that clean, empty, scentless air over and over. She sat and watched for a long time. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe 15. Nobody in the room spoke. After a while Drayvon shifted his weight and made a small sound in his throat, the kind of sound that meant patience was running low. One of the attendants near the door glanced at the Empress. The Empress kept her eyes on Lena. Lena kept her eyes on Voren. She was building a picture in her mind, not from training in dragon biology because she had none, but from years of sitting with small humans who could not use words yet and learning to read what their bodies were saying instead. Children who could not explain what was wrong but showed it in every small movement if you were patient enough to look. Voren was not sick. She could see that clearly enough even without medical equipment. His movements were strong, not weak. His cry was loud, not thin. He was not fading. He was not limp or still. He was fighting something, and losing and fighting again and losing again continuously without rest. The room was the problem. She was almost certain of it now. The light was too even. No shadow, no variation, no change, just flat brightness from every angle at once. For a newborn whose eyes were still learning to understand the world, that kind of light would feel like being trapped. Natural light moved. Natural light had direction. This light had none. The smell was wrong too. Empty air was not natural air. Even a clean forest had 1,000 small scents layered on top of each other. Earth, leaves, moisture, wood, the faint warmth of sunlight on stone. Those scents were information to a newborn. They said, "You are somewhere real. You are safe. The world is here." Filtered, recycled, scentless air said nothing. It was like trying to hear a voice in total silence. The absence itself became noise. And the nest, smooth, uniform, perfect, gave his claws nothing to grip. He kept scraping because he was looking for texture, for variation, for something that felt like ground, felt like the natural world felt, and finding the same smooth surface every time. He was overwhelmed and understimulated at the same time. Too much flat light, too much cold clean air, too much sameness, and not enough of anything real. Lena took a quiet breath and looked up. She spoke in a calm, even voice, not to Voren but to the room. She explained what she had observed. She kept it simple and clear. She said the lighting was too uniform and was likely distressing for eyes still learning to process the world. She said the air had been so thoroughly cleaned that there was nothing in it for a newborn's nose to read, and that scent was a primary source of safety information for very young creatures. She said the nest materials, while clearly fine quality, were too smooth and consistent to give a hatchling's body the sensory feedback it was looking for. She said all of this quietly, without judgment, without drama, looking at no one in particular. When she finished there was a short silence. Then Drayvon laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the short, dismissive laugh of a professional who had just heard something he considered too simple to take seriously. He said that the chamber environment had been calibrated to precise imperial standards. He said that Drakaveth hatchlings had been raised in ship environments for generations without issue. He said that suggesting the problem was the room, not the hatchling, was an observation that showed a fundamental lack of understanding of dragon physiology. He said it politely. He said it thoroughly. He made it clear that he was not angry, simply correct. Lena listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished she did not argue. She did not raise her voice or repeat herself with more force. She simply said, with the same calm she had carried since she walked through the door, that she understood his position, and that she was not claiming to know dragon biology better than he did. She was only sharing what she saw. She said the patterns Voren was showing were patterns she had seen before in young creatures overwhelmed by environment, and that it might be worth considering, given that everything else had already been tried. Another silence. It was the Empress who broke it this time. She had been watching Lena the entire time, watching her face, watching her stillness, watching the way she sat on the floor without any trace of performance or urgency, just a woman paying attention to a small creature in distress. The Empress had seen many healers in this room over 3 days. None of them had sat on the floor. None of them had simply watched first. The Empress looked at her husband. Emperor Soreth had not moved from his position near the doorway. His arms were uncrossed now. He was leaning forward slightly, just slightly, the way a person leans when something has caught their full attention without them meaning to let it. He looked at Lena sitting cross-legged on the floor of his royal chamber, bag beside her, watching his son with steady, patient eyes. He looked at Drayvon. He looked back at Lena. And then he spoke, low, direct, with the full weight of a man who had run out of other options and knew it. Then what do you suggest? Lena reached down beside her and picked up her bag. She did not stand up. She did not move toward the nest. She stayed exactly where she was, sitting cross-legged on the floor 2 meters away from Vorin, and simply placed the bag in her lap and began to open it slowly. No sudden movements. No rush. Just the quiet, unhurried motion of someone who had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it carefully. Drayvon watched her with his arms still crossed. The 2 attendants near the door leaned forward slightly without meaning to. Empress Vaila sat perfectly still in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her tired eyes fixed on the small human woman on the floor. Emperor Soreth had not moved from the doorway. He was watching too, quietly with that same forward lean he had not straightened out of since asking his question. Vorin was still screaming. The sound filled the room the way it had filled it for 3 days, sharp, continuous, exhausting. But Lena did not react to it the way everyone else in the room did. Everyone else tensed slightly every time the sound peaked, the way you tense when something hurts near you and you cannot stop it. Lena just breathed through it and kept her movements slow and steady, like the screaming was simply weather, present, noted, not a reason to hurry. She opened the top of her bag. The bag was not large, just a soft-sided personal carry bag, the kind people packed with small comforts from home for long deep space voyages. She had packed it herself before leaving Earth several months ago. Her mother had added things without asking the way mothers did. Her grandmother had sent a small package to add at the last minute. Lena had smiled at it then and packed it without opening all of it because there were too many other things to do before departure. She was glad now that she had not thrown any of it away. She reached in and took out a small sealed container, round, flat, no bigger than the palm of her hand. The seal on it was simple, just a press-closed lid, and she opened it with a soft click. The smell came out immediately. It was not a sharp smell or a strong smell. It was warm. That was the only word for it. Warm, the way a kitchen is warm when something is being made in it, the way a garden is warm in the early morning when the sun first reaches it. It was honey, real honey, thick and golden, mixed with something fruity and something faintly floral, a recipe that had existed in Lena's family for 3 generations and had no official name except what her grandmother called it, the good jar. Behind the honey there were other smells rising from the open bag now, dried herbs wrapped in thin paper, the faint woody smell of something carved from real earth timber, the clean soft smell of natural cloth woven from cotton. Small things. Simple things. Things that cost nothing and came from a world very far away. They were the smells of earth. Real earth, not filtered, not recycled, not cleaned into emptiness. Soil and sun and growing things in the hands of people who made things slowly and with care. Vorin stopped screaming. Not gradually. Not slowly. He stopped the way a switch turns off, completely, suddenly, in the middle of a breath. One moment the sound was filling the room and the next moment it was gone, and the silence that replaced it was so total that every person in the chamber felt it physically, like pressure releasing from their ears. The Empress's hands came apart in her lap. Her mouth opened slightly. One of the attendants made a small involuntary sound. Drevon's arms uncrossed. Vorin was still. His small body had gone from tight and fighting to completely motionless in a single second. His eyes were open now, and they were fixed on Lena. Not on the bag, not on the container, but on Lena herself, as though she were the source of whatever had just changed in the air. His nostrils were working rapidly, pulling in the new smell, processing it, reading it the way a newborn reads everything with its whole body at once. His tiny claws had stopped their endless scraping against the nest floor. His wings, pressed flat for 3 days, shifted very slightly, relaxing just a fraction, just enough to notice. Lena did not react to the silence with excitement. She did not look up at the room or smile at the Empress or say anything to Drayvon. She kept her eyes on Vorin and her body completely still and let the smell do what it was doing without interruption. She counted slowly in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Vorin did not start screaming again. She reached back into the bag and took out a piece of soft cloth, natural cotton worn from many washes into something almost as soft as skin. She placed it on the floor in front of her slowly, smoothing it flat with one hand. Then she took out a small wooden carving. A simple shape, rounded edges, made from dark earthwood that still held its forest smell after all these months. She placed it on the cloth. Then she did something that made the Empress lean forward in her chair. She began to hum. It was not a song anyone on that ship would have recognized. It was an old lullaby, the kind with no real words, just sound, just a rising and falling of tone that had been sung to small humans for longer than anyone could properly remember. Lena's grandmother had hummed it. Her mother had hummed it. Lena had hummed it to dozens of small children over 6 years of working in early childhood education, in moments exactly like this one, when a child was overwhelmed and needed the world to become smaller and simpler and softer for a while. She hummed it now the same way she always had. Quietly. Without performance. Just a steady, warm sound underneath the silence of the room. Voren's head moved. It was a tiny motion, just a slow turn toward the sound, the way a plant turns toward light without deciding to. His eyes, which had been fixed and wide, softened slightly. His breathing, which had been fast and shallow from 3 days of screaming, began to slow down in small degrees. Lena kept humming. She reached into the container with the tip of a clean corner of the cloth and touched it to the honey mixture. Just a small touch, just enough to carry the scent and a trace of the taste, and then she held that corner of cloth out toward Voren. She did not move closer. She did not reach toward him. She simply extended her arms slowly and held the cloth in his direction, close enough that the smell would carry to him, and then she waited. She hummed and she waited. Voren looked at the cloth. His nostrils flared. He pulled his head back slightly, cautious, uncertain, and then stretched forward again, drawn by the smell despite the caution. He did this twice more, that small forward and back motion of a creature deciding whether something was safe. Then he stretched his neck fully forward and touched the tip of the cloth with his tongue. Just once. A single tiny touch. He pulled back and processed whatever his senses were telling him. His eyes moved. Something in his expression shifted. Not into happiness exactly, not yet, but into something that was not distress. Something quieter. Something that might become calm if it was given enough time and space to get there. Lena held the cloth steady and kept humming. Voren leaned forward again and licked the cloth tip a second time. Then a third. Each time he pulled back a little less. Each time he leaned forward a little sooner. His breathing had slowed noticeably now. The rigid tension that had held his small body locked for 3 days was softening. Not gone, not all at once, but loosening at the edges. He made a sound. Not a scream. Not a cry. Something lower, something rounder. A soft rumble deep in his small chest that lasted only a second but landed in the silent room like a stone in still water, sending something outward in every direction. The Empress pressed both hands flat against her own chest. Emperor Soreth in the doorway went absolutely still. Draven stared at the hatchling with the expression of a man watching something his training had told him was not possible. And then Voren, the royal hatchling of the Drakaveth Empire, the son of an emperor, the child that the finest healers in the galaxy could not comfort, crawled forward slowly to the edge of his nest, extended one small step onto the floor, crossed the short distance to the human woman sitting cross-legged with a cloth in her hand, and placed his head against her knee. His eyes closed. His breathing slowed to the deep, even rhythm of a creature finally, completely at rest. Lena kept humming. She did not move. She did not reach down to hold him or pick him up. She just sat there, still and steady, and let him sleep. The room was so quiet that the hum of the ship's engines, always there, always ignored, became the loudest thing in it. Nobody moved for a long time. Voren was asleep. Truly asleep, the deep, heavy sleep of a creature that had been exhausted for days and had finally, completely let go. His small chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm. His claws were relaxed. His wings lay loose against his sides. The tightness that had held every part of him rigid for 3 days was simply gone, replaced by the boneless stillness of real rest. Lena kept humming softly for a few minutes longer, not because she needed to, but because she did not want to break the quiet too soon. She had learned that with children, the moment after the storm was as fragile as glass. You did not move fast. You did not speak loudly. You let the calm settle like dust after wind, slowly and completely before you did anything else. When she finally let the hum fade and stopped, the silence held. She looked up at the room for the first time since opening her bag. The Empress had not moved from her chair. She was still sitting with both hands pressed flat against her chest, and her eyes, those tired red-edged eyes that had not properly closed in 3 days, were full of something that had no name in any formal language. She was looking at her son sleeping against the knee of a human woman on the floor of the royal chamber, and her face showed the particular expression of a mother who has been terrified for a very long time and has just been allowed for the first time to breathe. Emperor Sorath had stepped fully into the room at some point. Lena had not noticed exactly when. He was standing a few meters away, arms at his sides, and he was looking at Voron with an expression that was nothing like the face of an emperor. It was simpler than that. Quieter than that. It was just a father looking at his sleeping child. Dravon had not moved from his place near the wall. His notes were still in his hand, but he was not looking at them. He was looking at the hatchling. His face was carefully composed in the way that experienced professionals compose their faces when something has happened that they do not yet know how to process. One of the attendants near the door had tears at the edges of her eyes and was clearly hoping nobody would notice. After a while the Emperor looked at Lena. She carefully shifted, slowly so as not to wake Voron, and moved the soft cloth from her hand down to the floor beside him so the scent would stay near him while he slept. She tucked the wooden carving close to the cloth. Then she rose gently to her feet, picked up her bag and took a few quiet steps back from the sleeping hatchling. The Emperor looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, simply without decoration, that he would like her to explain what she had done and why it had worked. Not a request exactly. Not quite a command either. Something in between, spoken by a man who had spent 3 days not understanding something and had decided he was willing to admit that now. Lena nodded. She looked around the room, at the Empress, at Dravon, at the attendants, and began to speak in the same calm plain voice she had used since she first walked through the door. She said that what Voron had been experiencing was not illness. It was not a sign of weakness or bad fortune. It was something much simpler and much harder to see when you were looking for something complicated. She said that newborns, any newborn of any species in her experience, were not born into the world ready. They arrived unfinished in certain ways, with senses wide open and no filter yet for what was important and what was not. Everything came in at full strength. Every sound, every smell, every light, every texture. All of it at once, all of it equally loud in the nervous system of a creature that had not yet learned to sort the world into safe and not safe, familiar and not familiar. She said that what a newborn needed most in those first days and weeks was not perfection. It was not sterile conditions or precise temperature control or medically calibrated nutrition. Those things mattered, yes, but they were not enough on their own. What a newborn needed was information it could recognize. Warmth that felt like warmth and not just the correct temperature. Smells that carried meaning, the smell of something living, something natural, something that said the world is real and you are in it. Textures with variation, with roughness and softness mixed the way real things were mixed in the natural world. Sounds with a human quality, or a dragon quality, or whatever quality that particular creature was built to find familiar. Sounds that moved and changed and breathed. She said that humans had not always known this. She said it plainly without making it sound like a gift. She said that humans had spent a long time doing things wrong with their own newborns, keeping them in clean, quiet, separate environments and wondering why they struggled. It took a long time and a lot of careful watching and some very honest admissions of error before human understanding shifted. Before people began to realize that what looked like comfort to an adult, clean, quiet, controlled, could feel like emptiness to a newborn who needed the world to smell and sound and feel like something. She said she suspected the same thing had happened here, perhaps over generations of space travel. The old ways had been replaced slowly and sensibly, piece by piece, with modern and efficient things. And nobody had noticed what was being lost because nothing dramatic had gone wrong until now. The room was very quiet when she finished. The Emperor stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the floor for a moment, and then looked at his son sleeping peacefully against the soft cloth Lena had laid down for him. He did not say anything yet. Dravon said something. He said it carefully, in a measured voice, and what he said was a small and technical objection. Something about the differences between human newborn neurology and Drakaveth hatchling development, something about how the comparison may not fully apply. It was not said with the dismissive confidence of before. It was said with the careful tone of a man building a small wall around something that had shaken him. Lena listened to the whole thing. She nodded. She said he was right that she did not know the specific details of Drakaveth newborn neurology. She said she was not a dragon healer and had no intention of pretending otherwise. But she said, quietly looking directly at him, that the results were in the room and they had not been there an hour ago. Dravon looked at Voron. He looked at him for a long time. Then he did something that Lena could see cost him a great deal. He uncrossed his arms. He placed his notes on a nearby surface. He stood up straight and looked at Lena with the careful dignity of a very proud person doing something uncomfortable, and he asked her, in a low voice without flourish, if she would be willing to share more of what she knew. Not to prove her right. He did not say that part. He did not need to. He said only that he would like to understand what she had observed and what it might mean for hatchling care going forward. He said it the way people ask things when they already know the answer has changed something and they are still deciding how they feel about that. Lena said yes. She said it simply without making anything of his asking. The Emperor nodded once and left the room. Not because he was done, Lena understood that, but because emperors did not linger in doorways after decisions had been made. Later that evening, when the ship had settled into its night cycle and Vorin was still sleeping peacefully with an attendant watching close by, there was a quiet knock at the door of the small room Lena had been given in the human section. She opened it. The Empress stood in the corridor alone. No attendants. No guards at her immediate side. She was still regal in the way she held herself. That kind of bearing did not turn off, but she was wearing something simpler than her formal clothes and her silver scales in the low corridor light looked softer than they did in the bright royal chamber. She asked if she might come in for a moment. Lena stepped back and let her in. They sat, the Empress in the room's one chair, Lena on the edge of the small bunk, and the Empress said what she had come to say. She said it without the formal structure of imperial speech, without titles or ceremony. She said that she had sat beside her son for 3 days and had not been able to help him. She said that she had watched Lena walk in with a small bag and sit on the floor and do what 3 days of the Empire's best efforts could not do. She said, and her voice was very even but her eyes were not, that she wanted Lena to know that she understood what had been given in that room today. Not just the skill of it, the attention of it, the willingness to sit still and look at a small creature and truly try to hear what he was saying. She said, quietly and only once, thank you. Not as an empress. Not as an ally in a diplomatic arrangement. As a mother who had been frightened for her child and had been helped by someone who did not have to help. Lena received it the way it was given, simply and with full understanding of what it meant. Outside in the corridor, the great ship moved on through deep space. And in the royal chamber, for the first time in 3 days, there was nothing but silence and the sound of a small hatchling breathing slowly in his sleep. The morning after Vorin slept through the night for the first time, the ship felt different. Not in any way that could be measured or recorded in an official log. The corridors looked the same. The lights ran at the same level. The engines made the same low sound they always made. But something in the atmosphere of the Crown of Embers had shifted, the way air shifts before weather changes, quietly and completely before anyone has named what is coming. The crew knew. Word had moved through the ship the way word always moves through closed spaces, in whispers, through doorways, between people who were not supposed to be talking about it but could not help themselves. The royal hatchling had stopped screaming. The human woman had done it. 1 night, 1 bag, 1 small jar of something from Earth, and 3 days of imperial failure had been undone. Some of the crew had stopped Lena in the corridor that morning, not formally, not with any ceremony, just stopped her quietly and dipped their heads in the small nod that she had learned, meant something respectful in Drakaveth body language. A younger attendant had looked at her with open curiosity and asked, very politely, if she would be willing to talk sometime about what she knew. One of the kitchen staff had left a small arrangement of ship-grown herbs outside her door without any note attached. Lena had accepted all of it with the same quietness she carried everywhere. She was not someone who needed recognition. She had not come here for it. She had come because a small creature was suffering and she thought she might be able to help, and that was the full extent of her intention. She spent the morning in the royal chamber with Vorin, continuing what she had started. She had brought more items from her bag and from a few things she had gathered with permission from the ship's small botanical supply unit. Different textures, gentle scents, soft sounds. She was building something for Vorin slowly and carefully, not a treatment, not a medical protocol, just an environment that felt like somewhere real. Somewhere a newborn could begin to understand the world without being overwhelmed by it. Vorin was different in the morning light. Still cautious, still watchful in the way all new creatures were watchful, but no longer rigid with distress. He tracked Lena's movements with his eyes. When she spoke softly he turned his head toward her voice. When she placed a new textured cloth near him he touched it with careful curiosity instead of flinching away. He was, in the careful language of someone who did not want to say too much too soon, beginning to settle. Dravon came in mid-morning and stood at a distance, watching. He had a fresh set of notes and he was writing things down. Real observations this time, not conclusions he had already decided on. He did not speak to Lena much but he watched carefully, and once, When Vorin responded to a particular soft sound Lena made by lifting his head with clear interest, Dravon wrote something quickly and underlined it. The Empress sat in her chair and watched her son with the particular expression of someone who had been handed back something they were afraid they had lost. It was a calm morning. The kind of morning that felt like it might last. It did not last. Lord Grievin came to the royal chamber just before midday. He did not come alone. He brought 2 senior court officials with him, older dragons, formally dressed, carrying the quiet authority of people who had spent their careers knowing exactly which rules applied to which situations. He also brought a document. It was not long, but it was old, the kind of document that had been written so long ago that the language in it was slightly formal even by Drakaveth standards, full of words that meant specific things in specific contexts. He presented it to the Empress with a low bow and a carefully neutral expression. He said, politely, thoroughly, without raising his voice, that he had spent the previous evening reviewing imperial protocol regarding access to members of the royal bloodline. He said that the document he was presenting cited a law that had been in place for over 400 years. The law stated clearly that no being of non-Drakaveth origin could form an unsupervised or ongoing bond of care with a member of the royal family without formal review by the imperial court. He said that he was not questioning what had happened the previous evening. He said the results spoke for themselves and he was glad the hatchling was resting. But he said that allowing the situation to continue without review was a breach of imperial law, and that as the Emperor's senior advisor it was his duty to raise this formally before it went any further. He said all of this in the tone of a man doing something reasonable and responsible. The Empress read the document. She read it fully without rushing, while Grievin and his 2 officials stood waiting and the chamber was very quiet. Then she looked up and said in an equally measured tone, that she would review the matter and that Lena should return to the human quarters for the time being while the question was considered. Lena had been sitting on the floor with Vorin. She looked at the Empress. The Empress met her eyes briefly, an expression that was hard to read but carried something in it that was not agreement with what was happening, just the careful management of something that needed to be handled correctly. Lena nodded. She placed the soft cloth near Vorin, put the wooden carving within his reach and stood up slowly. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door without any change in her expression and left the chamber quietly. Grievin watched her go with the composed satisfaction of someone who had moved a piece on a board exactly where they wanted it. For approximately 4 minutes the chamber was calm. Then Vorin noticed. It did not happen all at once. It started with the small searching motion, that slow turn of his head, his nostrils reading the air, finding the familiar scent and not finding it where it should be. He turned toward the door. He turned back. He made a low sound, not a scream, not yet, just a questioning sound, the sound of something looking for a thing it expected to be there. He looked at the place on the floor where Lena had been sitting. Then he looked at the Empress. His eyes were wide and the tension was coming back into his small body by degrees, the wings pressing flat, the claws beginning their scraping motion against the nest floor. The Empress stood up. She looked at the cloth and the wooden carving Lena had left. Vorin had pulled the cloth close to himself and was holding it, which was slowing the distress but not stopping it. Without the scent, without the voice, without the specific living presence that his nervous system had spent the night learning meant safety, the objects were comfort but not enough. He began to cry. Not the full screaming of before, not yet, but the precursor to it, the rising sound of a creature losing its footing, beginning to slide back toward the place it had just come from. The Empress looked at Grievin. Grievin looked at the hatchling with the expression of a man recalculating something. He opened his mouth slightly, perhaps to suggest something, perhaps to explain the law again, but the Empress had already made her decision. She was not a woman who needed time to think when her child was in front of her. She straightened to her full height. She turned to the senior court official on Grievin's left and told him, in the clear, direct language of someone who was not making a request, to bring the human liaison back immediately. Then she turned to Grievin and told him in the same tone, that she was invoking the primary welfare decree, an older law than the one he had cited, older by nearly 200 years, which stated simply that the physical and emotional welfare of a royal hatchling superseded all procedural considerations without exception. She said furthermore that effective immediately she was designating Lena as Vorin's comfort keeper, a role that carried royal recognition, required no further review under the primary welfare decree, and which Grievin had no authority to challenge without the Emperor's direct instruction. She said it all in one breath, evenly looking at him directly. Grievin said nothing. He was too experienced to show what he was feeling on his face, but something in the set of his jaw changed slightly. The court official left the room quickly. Lena had not gone far. She had been walking slowly down the corridor, not because she was reluctant to leave, but because something in her had been listening behind her for the sound she had been afraid would come. When the official reached her and said the Empress was asking her to return, Lena was already turning around. She walked back into the royal chamber without hurry. Vorin heard her before she reached the nest. His head came up. His nostrils found what they were looking for. The rising cry dropped back, not all the way down immediately but down and continuing to fall with each step she took closer. By the time Lena sat back down on the floor in her place, Vorin had already crawled forward to the edge of the nest. He crossed the floor and pushed himself against her side. Not against the cloth. Not toward the wooden carving. Against her, the specific living warm presence of her, and he settled there with a sound so low and so content that several people in the room had to look away for a moment. Grievin left shortly after. He made no scene. He was too careful for scenes. But Lena felt his eyes on her back as he walked out and understood clearly that this was not the end of his objection, only the end of this particular move. She looked down at Vorin pressed against her side and thought that whatever came next, it could wait. Right now the hatchling was calm. And that was the only thing that mattered. The crown of embers reached the Drakaveth homeworld on a clear morning. Lena stood at the small viewport in her quarters and watched it come into view slowly, the way large things always came into view from space, first as a shape, then as a color, then as something real. It was darker than Earth. Deeper greens and long stretches of dark red stone that caught the system's sun and held it. Mountain ranges that from this distance looked like brushstrokes. Oceans that were not blue but a deep, heavy gray-green that moved differently than Earth oceans moved, slower and thicker, like something ancient and patient. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are completely themselves, not trying to look like anything else, not asking to be compared to anything familiar. Just entirely, quietly what they were. She stood there for a while and looked at it. The past several days had settled into a rhythm that felt, in the strange way that intense experiences sometimes do, like it had always been this way. She spent her mornings with Vorin in the royal chamber. She spent her afternoons in long conversations with Drayvon, who had put his pride down somewhere and not picked it back up again and who asked questions with the focused intensity of someone determined to understand something fully before he moved on from it. She spent her evenings writing notes, detailed, careful notes that she had begun to think of not just as a personal record but as something that might matter later to other people in other places. Vorin had continued to change day by day. The progress was not dramatic. It was the quiet, steady progress of a creature finding its footing in the world, one small discovery at a time. He was curious now in a way that had not been visible before, through all that distress. He investigated things. He touched things carefully with one claw before committing to them. He had begun making a range of sounds that Drayvon, consulting old texts he had not opened in years, identified as early communicative vocalizations. Sounds that meant something, expressing something, directed at specific things and specific people. He directed them at Lena most often. She had not let herself think too much about the leaving. There was a particular kind of feeling that came with caring for something small and vulnerable, a feeling that attached itself quietly and deeply without announcing itself, and Lena had learned over years of working with young children that the only way through it was not to look at it directly until it was time. So she had not looked at it. She had stayed present, stayed useful, stayed focused on Vorin and on passing everything she knew to Drayvon and the attendants who would continue what she had started. But now the homeworld was in the viewport and the leaving was today and she looked at it directly for the first time and felt it settle in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. She took a breath. She picked up her bag. She went to say goodbye. The royal chamber was fuller than usual when she arrived. Word had spread, as it always did on a ship, and people had found reasons to be nearby. Attendants who did not strictly need to be present were present. A few of the crew members she recognized from the corridor nods were standing just outside the open door. Even two of the large door guards, who had looked at her with complete dismissal on the first night, were standing straighter than usual and facing inward instead of outward. Drayvon was there. He stood near the wall, his familiar position, but without his arms crossed and without his notes in his hand for the first time since she had met him. He looked at her when she came in and gave her a nod that was small and formal and carried more weight than most speeches she had heard in her life. The Empress was there, seated, composed, her silver scales bright in the chamber light. She looked rested. Genuinely rested. The deep kind, the kind that came from several consecutive nights of sleep rather than brief unconscious collapses out of pure exhaustion. The difference in her face was significant and Lena was glad to see it. Anne Vorin was there, awake, alert, sitting upright in his nest with his wings slightly open and his pale gold eyes moving around the room with the confident curiosity of a creature who had decided the world was interesting rather than frightening. When he saw Lena, he made a sound immediately. The particular rising sound she had come to understand was his version of recognition, of greeting, of something that translated roughly as "there you are," and he moved to the edge of the nest and waited for her to come to him. She crossed the room and sat down beside the nest the way she always did, on the floor at his level, unhurried, and Vorin leaned forward and pressed his head briefly against her shoulder in the gesture he had developed over the past days that she had privately decided was his version of a hug. She stayed very still and let him. Then the Emperor arrived. He came with several senior court members and both the human and Drakaveth diplomatic delegations. People in formal clothing, people carrying the weight of official occasions. The chamber rearranged itself quietly around his entrance, everyone finding their proper place the way people did when ceremony was beginning. Emperor Soreth stood in the center of the room and looked at the assembled company, and then he spoke. He spoke about the voyage. He spoke about what it had set out to accomplish. The building of a formal alliance between two species who had known each other only briefly and carefully from a cautious distance. He said the voyage had accomplished that. The agreements had been signed. The alliance was real. But then he paused. He said that something else had happened on this voyage that he had not planned for and could not have predicted. He said that he had stood outside a door for 3 days feeling the particular helplessness of a parent who cannot reach their child, and that he had been helped. Not by strategy, not by technology, not by the resources of an empire, but by a person who sat on a floor and paid attention. He said that in his experience power took many shapes. He had spent his life in the presence of the obvious shapes: strength, authority, knowledge, force. He said that he had learned on this voyage that there was another shape entirely. He called it the power of stillness. The power of a person who did not rush, did not assume, did not arrive with answers already formed, but instead arrived with nothing except the willingness to watch and listen until the truth of a situation became clear. He said that this shape of power was, in his observation, something humans carried in a particular way. He said he did not know if they were born with it or if they learned it or if they had simply been practicing it longer than his people had. He said it did not matter. What mattered was that it existed and that it had been brought into his ship and offered freely and without condition. He turned to face Lena directly. The room went very quiet. He said that in 400 years of recorded imperial history, no title of honor had ever been given to a non-Drakaveth being aboard the Crown of Embers. He said that this was not because no non-Drakaveth being had ever deserved one. He said it was because the opportunity had not arisen before. He said it was arising now. He spoke the words in formal Drakaveth first, slowly and clearly, and then he translated them into the common language so that everyone in the room and both delegations would understand exactly what was being said and why. Sorveth Kale. She who heard the unspoken. Lena stood very still while the title was given. She did not look away and she did not look down. She received it the way she received most things, directly and with the full understanding of what it meant. Around her she heard the formal response from the Drakaveth members of the room. A low sound, collective, something between a word and a tone, that Dravon had told her once was the sound of acknowledgement given in moments of genuine significance. The human delegation members were completely silent in the way that people are silent when they are trying very hard not to show that they are moved. Lena thought briefly of her grandmother in a small kitchen on Earth, stirring honey into a jar without knowing she was packing it for a moment like this. After the ceremony, when the formal part of the morning had concluded and people had begun the careful business of departure and farewell, Lena went back to Vorin one last time. She sat beside his nest. He came to the edge immediately and reached out with both front claws, small, careful, precise, and closed them around her index finger. Not gripping hard. Just holding. The way small creatures held things they were not ready to let go of but understood somehow they needed to. She looked at him, at his pale gold eyes, at the soft scales still carrying the newness of something recently arrived in the world, at the tiny wings folded neatly at his sides. She leaned forward slightly and said it quietly, just for him. "You are going to be just fine, little prince?" Vorin looked at her for a long moment. Then he made the low sound, the content rumble she had first heard on the night everything changed, and released her fingers slowly. She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She did not look back. Not because she did not want to, but because some goodbyes were better finished cleanly, and she had learned that too over years of sitting on floors with small creatures who needed the world to make sense. Later, when her ship had undocked and the Crown of Embers was growing smaller in the viewport behind her, Lena sat in her seat and looked out at the Drakaveth homeworld one last time as it turned slowly in the light of its sun. She thought about a small jar of honey in a care package from home. She thought about a soft cotton cloth worn down by too many washes. She thought about an old lullaby with no real words. She thought about sitting on a cold metal floor in the middle of the night and deciding that the most useful thing she could do was simply be still. She thought about her grandmother's hands moving in a small kitchen, doing something small and careful and full of love, not knowing and not needing to know that it would travel farther than she could ever imagine. Lena smiled. Outside the viewport the stars were very bright and very many, and the universe was as large as it had always been, full of species and histories and powers and forces that dwarfed anything a single person could bring to it. Except sometimes. Sometimes one person sat down on a floor and paid attention. Sometimes one person remembered that small things mattered. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the universe was not a fleet or a law or a title or a treaty. Sometimes it was just a human who remembered how to be still. And that, it turned out, was enough to cross any distance. Even the distance between stars.